There is a truth I have carried like a stone in my chest for many years. It is heavy, and it is sharp, and I have often wondered if silence was safer than speaking. But silence becomes its own kind of prison, and I have lived behind those bars long enough. Tonight, I want to open the door and tell you what happened to me, even though my hands tremble as I do it. I have spent decades inside these convent walls. From the outside, people see peace. Gardens neatly tended, prayers whispered at dawn, children taught to read their first hymns. They imagine a life without storms. But storms can brew even under roofs meant to protect. I know this because one of the fiercest tempests of my life began not in the world outside, but here, where I thought I would be safe. When I was young, faith was my anchor. While other girls dreamed of suitors and dances, I dreamed of chapels lit by candlelight, of vows whispered in front of the crucifix, of a life that felt purposeful in God's hands. My family was devout, and I grew up believing that service inside the church was the holiest road I could take. The day I entered the convent, I thought I was stepping into a sanctuary that would guard me for life. At first, it seemed exactly that. The older sisters welcomed me with tired but gentle smiles. The daily rhythm felt like music, rising before the sun, washing stone floors until they shone, singing psalms that echoed through vaulted halls. Every corner of the convent seemed to hum with God's presence, and I thought to myself, here, nothing can touch me. It was only later that I learned how wrong I was. There was a priest assigned as our confessor, a man others admired for his sermons and calm authority. He was the one we were told to trust with our souls. At the beginning, I did. He asked about my childhood, my studies, my struggles with prayer. His voice was warm, his eyes steady. I believed him when he said he wanted to guide me. I believed because I wanted to, but guidance slowly shifted into something else, something that made my skin crawl and my spirit shrink. The first time it happened, I remember the confusion more than the details. My mind could not accept that a man of God would misuse his role, so I convinced myself I had misunderstood. I walked back to my cell shaking, telling myself it would never happen again. But it did. It happened again and again, until I lost count of the nights. I will not give you details that wound, but I will tell you how it felt, like being trapped in a room with no doors. He made me believe I could not speak, that no one would believe me if I tried. He wore his collar like armor and told me obedience was my duty. And I, young and terrified, began to mistake obedience for silence. The change in me was visible. My laughter, once quick, disappeared. I stopped eating with the other sisters, choosing corners where no one would notice me. My health faltered. My body seemed to fold in on itself. Some whispered that I was fragile, that I was unsuited for the life I had chosen. I let them think it. It was easier than confessing the truth. I carried shame like a second skin. I thought perhaps I had done something to deserve it, that my faith was weak, that God himself had turned away. Each night I begged for deliverance, and each morning I woke with the same dread. Fear has a cruel way of twisting prayer into silence. Looking back, I see the signs others might have noticed. The dark circles under my eyes, the tremor in my hands during Mass, the way I jumped at the sound of his footsteps. But no one asked the right question, and I did not dare to answer even if they had. In a world built on hierarchy, my word against his felt as fragile as glass. It was during this time that I took the name Sister Elena. A new name should have been a new beginning, but for me it became a mask. I wore it outwardly, while inside I was breaking apart. The other sisters spoke my name with kindness, but I could barely recognize myself in it. People sometimes imagine that evil announces itself with thunder and shadow. In truth, it prefers silence. It hides in trusted voices and familiar faces. It waits in places where no one thinks to look. That is why it thrives inside walls that should be safe. That is why so many like me remain quiet, convinced the burden must be ours alone. But even in the darkest hours, grace has a way of slipping through the cracks. There were moments, small, fleeting, that kept me alive. A sister pressing a slice of bread into my hand when I had skipped supper. a child from the parish waving to me through the convent fence and calling my garden beautiful. A line of scripture that seemed to speak directly into my wound. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Those moments were thin threads, but I clung to them as if they were ropes. I want you to know, this story does not end here. It does not end in silence, and it does not end with him. At the time, I thought it might. I thought the rest of my life would be a long corridor of fear. But God had other plans, and He sent eyes that saw what others missed. One afternoon, I carried clean linens through a dim hallway. My arms were full, my head bent, when I felt another gaze on me. I looked up and met the eyes of an older nun, steady, searching, unwilling to be fooled. In that brief look, I felt something shift. For the first time in months, I wondered if perhaps someone might truly see me. That moment was small, but it was the beginning of everything. The key had turned a fraction in the lock. The door had not yet opened, but I heard the hinge groan. And in that sound, faint as it was, I found a reason to breathe again. To understand how I lost my innocence, you must first know how deeply I trusted. My roots were planted in faith from the beginning. I was born into a modest home where devotion was not a special occasion, but the air we breathed. My mother prayed while stirring pots on the stove, whispering hymns into the steam. My father, though quiet, showed his reverence through steady work and a seriousness that made me feel safe. We did not have wealth, but the cross above our kitchen door reminded me that God was our portion. As a child, I loved the church more than playgrounds. Sunlight through stained glass fascinated me. It made me believe heaven could spill into the world if only one stood still long enough to notice. While other girls giggled on pews, I leaned forward, mesmerized by the choir's voices rising and falling like wings. From those earliest years, I knew I wanted to belong fully to God. By the time I was a teenager, the path was clear. While friends talked about dances or suitors, my heart longed for convent walls and the steady rhythm of prayer. My parents saw the fire in me, and though it was hard to let me go so young, they placed their trust in God. And so one damp morning, with a small bundle of clothes and trembling excitement, I walked through the convent gates, believing I had entered a sanctuary that would never betray me. The beginning was everything I dreamed. The sisters welcomed me with worn smiles, their kindness carrying the weight of years in service. The rhythm of life settled around me like a chant. The bell before dawn, our voices joining in psalm, the shuffle of brooms along stone floors, the scent of herbs crushed between fingers in the garden. I learned how to fold linens until corners met, how to polish brass until I could see my reflection, how to make silence a companion rather than a punishment. In those days, every small duty felt holy. I thought I had finally arrived where my soul could rest. It was in those early months that I met the priest assigned as our confessor. He was admired in the parish, praised for his calm sermons and his ability to draw people into trust. When I first heard his voice behind the grill, it seemed warm, steady, safe. He asked about my family, my prayers, the little missteps of a new sister impatience, pride, distraction. He spoke of mercy as though it were close enough to touch. I believed him without hesitation. After all, who could doubt a man of God? At the same time, I was still learning to balance zeal with weakness. I wanted so badly to prove myself worthy that I often worked past exhaustion. When headaches came, I called it sacrifice. When I skipped meals, I named it fasting. The older sisters pressed bowls of broth into my hands and told me to rest, but I waved them away, thinking endurance was proof of holiness. I did not see how vulnerable that eagerness made me. Looking back, I noticed small signs that should have unsettled me sooner. A question from him that reached too far into my personal thoughts. A tone that carried something beyond spiritual counsel. A presence that lingered after the absolution. I brushed it aside, telling myself that charity demanded I see only the good. I chose blindness because I did not want to doubt someone placed over me. Season after season passed, and I grew comfortable in the convent's order. My life narrowed to a simple circle: prayer, work, silence, sleep. And in that circle, I felt safe, or at least I convinced myself I did. When I finally received the veil and was given my new name, Sister Elena, I felt transformed. A name carries power, and to me, it meant belonging. It meant a new birth into God's service. I whispered it to myself at night, believing it sealed me inside His protection. But innocence can be fragile glass. It shines, it holds beauty, yet one fracture is enough to shatter it completely. I did not see the crack forming until it was too late. I remember clearly the night the bell sounded different. It was the same tone, the same echo in the corridors, yet it struck me with unease. My steps down the hallway felt heavier, my palms damp against the folds of my habit. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves, just the weight of a long day. But deep down, I knew something was changing. That night, the sanctuary I thought unshakable would reveal its first fracture, and through it, darkness would begin to step inside. The night began like so many others, with the chapel cloaked in silence and the air thick with the scent of beeswax candles. After Compline, the sisters filed back to their cells, the halls quieting until only the echo of distant footsteps remained. I gathered my veil tighter around me, feeling a chill even though it was late spring. Something inside me stirred uneasily, as if the bell had rung not to summon prayer but to summon dread. I walked the familiar corridor toward the confessional. The stone floor was cold beneath my shoes, the shadows stretching long as though they wanted to hold me back. I told myself what I had always told myself. This is where sins are forgiven, where mercy is poured out. I whispered, "Jesus, I trust in you," hoping the words would quiet the thundering of my heart. When I entered, the small space felt heavier than usual. The grill separated us, but His presence filled the air in a way I could not name. His voice, calm as always, asked about my day. I spoke of laundry, of garden work, of struggling to keep my thoughts focused during the Psalms. He nodded softly, murmuring words of understanding. Yet slowly, His questions shifted. They pressed too closely into my private feelings, into places where confession should not wander. I froze, unsure. The tone in His voice was no longer only a priest's counsel, it carried something that unsettled me. I told myself I was imagining it. I reminded myself of His reputation, of the respect the sisters showed Him, of the sermons parishioners praised. Surely my unease was the weakness of a young sister, inexperienced, naive. But as the minutes stretched on, I felt the walls close in. His words bent Scripture into shapes I had never heard, twisting obedience into submission, humility into silence. He told me that secrecy was part of holiness, that God favored those who bore hidden sacrifices. My throat tightened. I wanted to run, but my feet would not move. I whispered prayers under my breath, but they fell like stones into a dry well. When at last I left the confessional, my body felt foreign to me, shaken, unsteady, as though some vital part had been stolen. I walked quickly down the corridor, clutching my rosary so tightly the beads left marks on my palm. I told myself it would not happen again. That night, I lay on my narrow bed staring at the crucifix on the wall, begging Christ to explain what I could not. My lips formed words, but no sound came. The days that followed blurred into one another. I worked harder, hoping exhaustion would silence my thoughts. I scrubbed the refectory floors until my knees ached, recited prayers until my voice cracked. I smiled at the older sisters when they asked if I was well, insisting I was fine. Fine, such a small word, yet it hid an ocean. But the silence of denial cannot last. Nights returned, the bell rang, and with it came the same corridor, the same confessional, the same fear rising in me like a tide. Each time I told myself I had misunderstood, that I was imagining things. Each time I left with a deeper wound I could not name aloud. My body began to bear the signs my lips could not. I lost weight. My cheeks hollowed. Dark circles deepened under my eyes. During prayers, my hands trembled so much I could barely hold my book. A kind sister offered me extra bread at supper one evening, her eyes soft with concern. "You must keep up your strength," she whispered. I thanked her and forced a smile, though the food turned to ash in my mouth. At night, I began to push my small dresser against the door of my cell, as if wood and iron could protect me from what I feared. Yet walls cannot guard against dread that follows you even into dreams. I woke often, breathless, my habit clinging to me with sweat. I pressed my face into the pillow so the others would not hear me cry. The betrayal was not only in what happened, it was in the way it reshaped my world. The chapel no longer felt safe. The very prayers that once comforted me now burned with questions. Did God see me? Did he hear me? Was my silence faithfulness? Or was it cowardice? Shame wrapped around me like a second skin, convincing me that the fault was mine. I longed to confide in someone, but fear tightened its grip. Who would believe a novice accusing a confessor? His word carried authority. Mine would sound like rebellion. And rebellion in the convent was not only frowned upon, it was seen as sin. I swallowed my voice, letting it sink deeper and deeper until I hardly recognized myself. Yet even in those first nights of betrayal, grace flickered faintly. A verse from the gospel clung to me. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. I repeated it under my breath when I felt weakest, though I barely believed it. I think God allowed me to cling to that one thread, because he knew I would need it to survive what was still to come. That first night marked the end of my innocence. From then on, every step in the corridor toward the confessional felt like walking into a storm I could not escape. And still, I went. Still, I stayed silent. Because fear, once it takes root, convinces you that silence is safer than truth. Silence became my companion, heavier than any vow I had ever spoken. It seeped into every hour, pressing against me like the stone walls of the convent. In the beginning, I told myself that what happened in the shadows of the confessional was only a mistake, an isolated wound that I could cover with prayer. But soon the rhythm became unbroken daylight devotion, nightfall dread, and silence was the thread binding it all together. Each morning I awoke to the bells. Their ringing, meant to call me into worship, struck instead like a cruel reminder. Another day of pretending. I rose with the sisters, washed my face in cold water, and forced my hands into steady movements. To them, I was diligent and obedient. To myself, I was hollow. The girl who had entered the convent with trembling hope was fading, replaced by someone who wore a mask too well. During chores, I bent lower than necessary, scrubbing floors until the stones glistened, kneeling long after others had left. My palms blistered, my knees burned, but the ache gave me something tangible, something that made sense. Pain from work was pure, almost honest. It told me I was alive, and it kept my mind from wandering back to the nights I wished I could erase. At meals, I learned to mimic joy. I laughed when others laughed, nodded when spoken to, passed bread with a smile I had rehearsed in my cell. Yet every sound around me felt muffled, as though I was sealed behind glass. The sisters thought me devoted, even saintly, because of the way I poured myself into discipline. If only they knew that my zeal was not faith but desperation, a frantic attempt to bury a secret that would not stay hidden inside my heart. Night was the enemy I could not defeat. When dusk fell, my stomach turned to stone. I lingered in the chapel, staring at the flicker of candles until the wax ran low. I prayed so hard my lips cracked. Lord, I whispered into the silence, if you see me, deliver me. If you hear me, answer me. Yet the chapel walls gave no reply, and the crucifix above seemed to weep with me in its own silence. When the confessional door creaked, my courage died. Fear replaced every word I might have spoken. My voice retreated into the corners of my chest, where it rattled like a caged bird. I wanted to cry out, to tell the truth, but shame sealed my lips. Each night I left feeling smaller, as though pieces of me were being stripped away and carried into the dark. The silence began to shape me. I avoided mirrors because the eyes staring back looked like those of a stranger, haunted, hollow, always bracing for the next shadow. My rosary beads, once smooth with comfort, felt like stones in my hand. I counted them anyway, desperate for some rhythm that would drown out the pounding of my heart. There were moments when I longed to confess not to him, never to him but to one of the sisters I trusted. Yet a voice inside whispered that they would not believe me. They would call me delusional, say I had mistaken instruction for harm. Worse, they might accuse me of tempting holiness itself. The fear of being cast out, not as a victim but as a sinner, silenced me even further. Days turned into weeks, weeks into seasons. I watched winter melt into spring, blossoms appear in the convent garden, and still, my silence stretched on. The outside world moved with the turning of the sun, but inside me, time had stopped the night of that first betrayal. I carried it like a stone in my chest, growing heavier with every breath. Sometimes, when exhaustion blurred my thoughts, I imagined running away. I pictured myself slipping through the convent gates under cover of night, fleeing into the unknown. But where would I go? I had entered these walls as a girl and knew nothing of life beyond them. The world outside felt like a vast sea, and I had no boat. My silence, as cruel as it was, became the prison I knew how to endure. One evening, after Compline, I stayed behind in the chapel. The sisters' footsteps faded, and the room emptied until only the faint glow of candles remained. I fixed my eyes on the crucifix, on Christ's broken body, and whispered, "Is my silence a sacrifice you demand? Is this how I serve you, by bearing chains I cannot name?" The words trembled, echoing into the hollow stillness. For a heartbeat, I thought the shadows would answer, but all I heard was the soft drip of wax against stone. I left that night with my soul heavier than before. Yet strangely, a spark remained. It was small, like a candle flickering in the wind, but it refused to die. I told myself that one day the silence would break. One day someone would see me, even if I could not speak. That thought was fragile, but it was enough to keep me breathing when despair urged me to give up. So I moved through each day with a hidden wound, bleeding in silence. And though no one noticed the cracks yet, deep inside I knew the moment would come when my mask would falter. For silence, no matter how carefully kept, cannot last forever. The silence I carried inside me did not stay invisible forever. It began to write itself upon my body, leaving marks that no veil could hide. My cheeks grew pale, my eyes sank into hollows, and the sisters whispered about my devotion. They said my thinness came from fasting, that my drawn face was proof of sanctity. If only they knew that what was wasting me was not holy sacrifice, but unspoken torment. At night, the fear that gnawed at me became so constant that I stopped sleeping. I lay on my straw mattress, staring at the ceiling beams, counting the creaks and cracks of the old convent roof until dawn. My body ached with exhaustion, yet the moment my eyes closed, I woke with a jolt, as though the darkness itself had reached to touch me. Soon, my hands began to tremble when I poured water at meals, and I could no longer carry heavy pots without spilling. I remember one morning in the laundry room, the steam rising around me like fog. My arms quivered as I wrung out a sheet, the fabric slipping from my hands into the bucket with a splash. One of the sisters noticed and frowned, telling me gently that I must eat more, that I was pushing myself too hard. I smiled weakly and nodded, but inside I thought, if only food could feed the places that are dying within me. Prayer, once my refuge, became another weight I could not carry. My lips still moved through the Psalms, but the words fell hollow, like ashes on my tongue. I asked God why He had hidden Himself, why He had left me in silence when I needed Him most. There were nights when I pressed my forehead against the cold stone floor of the chapel, whispering, "If you will not rescue me, then take me." Yet dawn always came, and I found myself still breathing, forced to endure another day. The body, I learned, keeps secrets only for so long. My stomach turned sour, rejecting food until even bread and water felt heavy. My hair thinned, strands falling into the basin as I washed. My steps slowed, and I grew faint halfway through chores, leaning against walls when no one was looking. I told myself to keep moving, to keep pretending, but my body betrayed me. My silence had become flesh, and it was breaking me from within. Worse than the body was the slow crumbling of my soul. Hope, once a flame, however small, flickered dangerously low. I began to believe that perhaps I deserved this suffering, that maybe my prayers went unanswered because I had somehow sinned. The confessor's voice echoed in my mind, twisting scripture into chains, convincing me that obedience meant silence, that holiness meant suffering without protest. I carried those lies like commandments, even as they poisoned me. There were moments when despair pressed so hard against my chest that I could hardly breathe. I recall standing in the garden one evening, the air sweet with blossoms, and thinking how easy it would be to disappear among the shadows. A few steps beyond the wall lay freedom, or perhaps oblivion. My feet longed to run, but my spirit felt too weak to carry me past the gate. I turned back inside, my shoulders heavy, ashamed even of the thought of escape. The sisters began to notice changes they could not explain. Some admired my piety, whispering that I was touched by grace because I seemed always lost in solemn reflection. Others worried quietly, asking if I was ill. I gave them vague smiles, told them I was fine, and returned to my cell to collapse in solitude. I wore my silence as carefully as I wore my habit, a garment stitched to hide every wound. But even silence frays. One evening during Vespers, my voice cracked on a hymn, a sob tearing through the melody before I could swallow it back. Heads turned, eyes lingered, but no one asked questions. Instead, they sang louder, drowning me out with holy words. I bowed my head in shame, tears slipping onto the wooden pew. In that moment, I realized I was vanishing not only from my own life, but also from theirs, becoming invisible even as I sat among them. What terrified me most was how numb I was becoming. In the beginning, each night filled me with terror, but as time passed, dread dulled into resignation. My heart stopped fighting. My body braced as though it had no choice but to endure. I feared that soon I would lose even the will to pray, to weep, to hope. To lose faith would mean to lose the last fragile piece of myself I still clung to. And so I drifted like a shadow through the convent halls, neither fully alive nor fully gone. My body ached, my soul cracked, and still the silence ruled me. Every day felt like a slow death, a breaking not of bones, but of spirit. I did not know it then, but the body and soul can only carry so much before someone notices the fracture. My unraveling was not yet complete, but the cracks were widening, and soon, very soon, someone would see through them. And when they did, my silence would no longer be mine to keep. The day it happened began like so many others. Gray skies pressed against the convent windows, the bell rang, and my body moved as though pulled by invisible strings. I had grown used to living half awake, drifting from task to task with my head lowered. I thought I had mastered the art of blending in, of hiding the tremors in my hands, the hollowness in my eyes, and the faint tremble in my steps. But shadows can never disguise themselves forever, and mine betrayed me. I was in the refectory, scrubbing wooden tables after the midday meal. My arms ached with each motion, my wrists raw from weeks of endless work and sleepless nights. A pitcher slipped from my grip, shattering against the floor with a sharp crack. For a moment, the sound stunned the entire hall into silence. Shards glistened on the stone tiles, water spreading across the floor like a pool of shame. I bent quickly to gather the pieces, whispering apologies, but my knees buckled beneath me. That was when she saw me. Sister Magdalene. She was older than I, with a gentleness in her face that the years of cloistered life had not managed to erase. She hurried forward, kneeling beside me before anyone else moved. Her hand touched my arm, not with reprimand, not with cold authority, but with concern. It was the first human warmth I had felt in what seemed like eternity. "You are trembling," she whispered, her eyes searching mine. I tried to smile, to dismiss it, to say the usual words, "I am fine, I am only tired." But the words stuck in my throat. My body betrayed me again, shoulders shaking as tears welled unbidden. I had hidden them for so long that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to weep openly. The sisters around us busied themselves with the mess, but Sister Magdalene did not move. Her gaze locked on me as though she could see every wound I carried beneath my habit. Later that evening, she found me in the corridor. I tried to walk past, to keep my silence intact, but she stepped gently into my path. "You cannot keep carrying this alone," she said softly. Her words pierced me, not because they were sharp, but because they were true. No one had dared to suggest that I might be carrying anything at all. For months, my pain had lived unspoken, disguised as piety, excused as devotion, but she had looked closer. She had seen what no one else had wanted to see. I wanted to run. I wanted to fold myself back into invisibility. Yet something inside me cracked a fragile corner of my silence, splintered under the weight of her compassion. For the first time, I felt the possibility that I was not entirely alone, that perhaps God had not abandoned me, but had sent this one witness into my darkness. That night, I could not pray as I usually did. Instead, I thought of her words. They echoed in my chest as I lay awake. "You cannot keep carrying this alone." I realized how long I had been drowning in the belief that no one would ever see, no one would ever care, and that suffering was my burden alone. But her eyes had told me otherwise. The next days blurred together, but Sister Magdalene did not let me slip back into silence. She found small excuses to walk beside me, to share tasks in the laundry, to ask gentle questions. She did not pry or demand confessions. She simply remained near, steady and patient. That presence was enough to unsteady the walls I had built around my heart. I recall one evening in the chapel when the candles flickered low. She sat near me in the pews, her hands folded. Without turning her head, she whispered, "You are not alone in your suffering. God does not abandon his children." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to let those words take root where despair had made its home. Yet I feared what would happen if I truly spoke. To voice my pain was to admit its reality, to risk punishment, to invite consequences I could not imagine. Still, something in her tone, in the unwavering calm of her presence, planted a seed I could not uproot. It was a strange paradox. Her gaze frightened me and comforted me all at once. To be seen felt unbearable, yet it also kept me alive. For the first time in months, I found myself wondering if maybe survival was not meant to be endured in silence, but shared. The day Sister Magdalene saw me was not the day I broke my silence that would come later, but it was the day my silence was pierced. The day another human soul bore witness to my unraveling and offered the faintest glimmer of hope. It was the day I realized that even in the deepest shadows, someone could still look into my eyes and see me. And that realization, fragile though it was, marked the first shift in the tide of my suffering. My body was still frail, my soul still bruised, but for the first time in so long, I no longer felt invisible. Someone had seen, and because of that, my story was no longer mine to bury alone. When Sister Magdalene's eyes first caught mine that night, something inside me unraveled. Until then, silence had been my weapon, my shield, my disguise. I believed if I never spoke, I could endure and survive. But after she saw me trembling, after she lingered in the corridor as I staggered back to my room, I understood that silence was no longer a shelter. It was a prison, and the cracks in its walls were beginning to widen. I remember that evening with searing clarity. The convent corridors were lined with flickering candles, shadows dancing against the stone walls. My steps faltered as I returned from the confessional, my body weak, my spirit burning with a shame I could no longer contain. By the time I reached my small cell, I collapsed onto the cold floor, clutching the bed frame as sobs tore through me. I had hidden them for so long, buried them deep, but now they came like a flood. My chest heaved, my voice choked, and the silence I had once clung to broke apart in gasps of anguish. That was when the door opened. I froze, thinking I would be punished for my weakness, but instead, Sister Magdalene slipped in quietly, her face lit by candlelight. She did not scold or retreat. She knelt beside me and placed her hand lightly on my shoulder. "You cannot carry this alone," she whispered. Her voice was not commanding, not questioning, but steady like the ground beneath me when I thought I was falling forever. And then it happened. Words I had never allowed myself to speak spilled out. I did not tell her everything. How could I? The darkness was too vast. But I told her enough. I told her how the summons filled me with dread, how I felt trapped in a cycle of devotion twisted into torment, how every prayer felt like ashes in my mouth because I no longer knew whether God listened to me at all. I expected disbelief. I expected her to recoil, to accuse me of blasphemy or madness. Instead, she took my shaking hands into her own and looked directly into my eyes. "You are not mad," she said firmly. "You are not weak. You are being wronged." Those words struck me harder than any blow I had ever endured. To hear the truth spoken aloud, not from my own guilty heart but from another's lips, was like thunder cracking through the suffocating night. I could not stop crying then, not because of despair but because of release. Yet revelation does not come without chaos. The very next morning I felt the air in the convent shift. Eyes lingered on me too long. Whispers stirred in corners of the hall. Perhaps it was the redness in my eyes. Perhaps it was the way I clung closer to Sister Magdalene in prayers. Whatever it was, my silence was no longer invisible. Suspicion was now alive among the sisters. By midday, the Mother Superior summoned me. Her face was stern, carved with lines of authority. "There are murmurs," she said. "They say you are distracted, that your devotion falters." My heart thudded so loud I could barely hear her words. If I spoke the truth in this moment, what would happen? Would I be cast out, punished, shamed as a liar? Fear gripped me so tightly I bowed my head and muttered words of obedience, promising to remain faithful. Outwardly I obeyed, but inwardly a storm had been set loose. Sister Magdalene found me again later, her expression troubled but resolute. She spoke quietly as we scrubbed floors side by side. "Do not bury it again," she urged. "Secrets rot the soul. Truth, no matter how heavy, is light compared to silence." Her courage terrified me. And yet, I felt something stirring inside me, a fragile courage of my own. That night at Vespers, I caught her eyes across the chapel. She gave me the smallest nod, a signal only I could read. "Stand firm." But firmness did not come easily. Chaos erupted not in shouts but in glances and whispers. Some sisters avoided me, as though my presence carried contagion. Others stared too long, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. I could feel the walls of the convent pressing closer, as though they too were listening for what I might say. I tried to continue my duties, folding linen, cleaning floors, chanting prayers, but my hands shook, my voice cracked, my body betrayed the turmoil inside. The truth was now alive, and once awakened, it refused to return to sleep. One night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the sound of distant bells echoing faintly. My heart was a battlefield, terror on one side, Sister Magdalene's words on the other. I remembered the way she had told me, "You are being wronged." No one had ever spoken such words for me. Could I dare to believe them? Could I dare to speak them aloud to others? The days that followed blurred into unease. The convent felt less like a sanctuary and more like a fragile stage, where every gesture could ignite suspicion, every word could spark fire. Revelation had broken my silence, but it had also brought danger, because once truth is spoken, it demands to be seen. I knew then with chilling certainty that the path ahead would not be calm. The moment Sister Magdalene heard my pain, my world shifted forever. Secrets that had chained me for so long were no longer safe in the dark. They trembled on the edge of exposure, and though fear pulsed through me like a drum, there was no turning back. Truth rarely enters softly, it storms in, overturning order, pulling walls down, demanding everything hidden come into light. Chaos was rising within the convent, and I could feel its first rumblings shaking the ground beneath me. For the first time, I understood. Silence was no longer possible. The time of hiding had ended, and nothing in my life would ever return to what it had once been. The storm that Sister Magdalene had awakened did not remain hidden for long. Secrets have a way of clawing their way into the open, and mine had grown too heavy to stay buried. The whispers in the convent corridors grew louder each day, like wind rattling shutters before a great storm. I felt their weight pressing on me with every glance, every question left unsaid. It was as if the walls themselves were demanding to know the truth I carried. One morning, the Mother Superior summoned me to her chamber. The heavy wooden door closed behind me with a thud that echoed in my chest. She sat rigid in her chair, her eyes sharp, her hands folded neatly on the desk. "There is unrest among the sisters," she said, her voice measured but cold. "They speak of strange behavior, of trembling during prayer, of bonds you share that seem unseemly." Her gaze pierced me. "I will ask you directly, what have you been hiding?" My throat went dry. For years I had practiced silence as though it were a holy vow. To speak now felt like stepping to the edge of a cliff. I wanted to vanish, to deny everything, but Sister Magdalene's voice echoed in my mind, "Do not bury it again. Secrets rot the soul." So I lifted my eyes to meet the Mother Superior's. My voice shook, but it did not break. "I have been wronged," I whispered, "by the one who should have been my protector." Her face did not move, but the air in the room tightened. "You will explain," she demanded. And so I did. Not in graphic detail, I could not bring myself to relive it in full, but enough to peel back the veil of silence. I spoke of fear that clung to me at night, of dread when the summons came, of prayers that turned to ashes because my soul felt desecrated. I spoke of shame I carried like a stone tied to my chest. The words came haltingly, but once spoken, they gathered strength, as though they had been waiting years for release. When I finished, the room was silent, but for the sound of my breathing. The Mother Superior studied me with eyes unreadable, her lips pressed into a thin line. At last, she said, "These are grave claims, child. Do you understand the weight of what you have spoken?" I nodded, though inside I trembled. Of course I understood. Truth has always been heavy. Later that day, I was called again, this time not alone. In the refectory, the long tables had been cleared, and the sisters gathered in tense rows. It was not a court of law, but it felt like one. Their eyes were the jury, their silence the judge. I stood at the front, my hands clasped so tightly they ached. Beside me stood Sister Magdalene, steady as a pillar, her presence the only thing keeping me from collapsing. The Mother Superior addressed the room. "Accusations have been made, a charge of grave misconduct, of betrayal of sacred trust." Her voice cut through the air. "We must weigh the truth." And so began my trial of truth. They asked questions sharp, doubting, relentless. How long had this happened? Why did you not speak sooner? Why did you not resist? Each question felt like a blade, cutting into my already raw soul. I tried to answer, but my words trembled. How could I explain the paralysis of fear? How could I make them see the chains that had bound me in silence? When I faltered, Sister Magdalene's voice filled the gaps. She told them what she had seen, the trembling in my body, the brokenness in my face, the nights when my sobs shook the walls. Her testimony was firm, unwavering. She risked everything to stand beside me, and I will never forget the steadiness in her tone. Yet the room was divided. Some sisters' faces softened with sorrow, their eyes brimming with compassion. Others frowned, suspicion etched deep into their brows. I could hear their unspoken thoughts. Could this really happen here, within these holy walls? Or is this child weaving lies born of weakness? The weight of their doubt pressed on me like iron. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, clutching my rosary as though it might hold me together. My voice cracked, but I forced myself to speak. I did not choose this suffering. I carried it in silence because I feared you would not believe me. But I cannot bear it alone any longer. Whether you accept it or not, this is the truth. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, slowly, one of the elder sisters rose. Her voice, though frail with age, carried through the hall. "I believe her," she said simply. I have seen the shadow in her eyes, the way her spirit has bent beneath a burden no child should carry. That single voice shifted the air. Another sister spoke, then another. Not all believed, but some did, and their belief gave me strength. It was not full vindication, but it was a crack in the wall of doubt, a glimmer of light in the darkness. The Mother Superior ended the gathering with a grave decree. "The matter will not end here, it will be investigated. But for now, silence must be kept beyond these walls. The world outside must not know." Her words cut deep. Even in revelation, even in this trial of truth, secrecy still clung like a shroud. But inside me, something had shifted. For the first time, I was not alone. For the first time, my voice had been heard. That night, I lay awake not with fear, but with a strange, fragile hope. Chaos had not ended. It had only begun, but I had spoken truth aloud, and truth, once born, cannot be buried again. And though the path ahead was uncertain, though shadows still lingered, I felt a spark within me. The beginning of freedom. The faint but steady pulse of survival. When the trial of truth ended, I thought the weight would lift from my chest, that peace would finally come. But I quickly learned that truth does not heal overnight. It unsettles. It breaks open wounds that have long festered in silence, leaving them raw and bleeding under the light. The days that followed were heavy with tension, whispers, and silence that screamed louder than words. I would walk through the cloisters and feel eyes on me, some tender, some cold. Those who believed me offered quiet nods or gentle touches on my arm. Others turned their faces away, as though I carried a contagion. And though Sister Magdalene stayed faithfully by my side, I could not silence the gnawing fear inside me. Perhaps speaking out had only made me more of an outcast, but something had changed in me as well. For the first time, I had chosen honesty over silence, and that choice gave me a strength I had never known. At night, when the shadows pressed close and memories clawed at me, I clutched my rosary and whispered prayers not of fear, but of defiance. I begged not just for deliverance, but for the courage to keep living, even if the path ahead remained broken. The Mother Superior, true to her word, launched an inquiry. She did not share every detail with me, but I could feel the ripples it caused. The priest who had once been untouchable now stood under a cloud of suspicion. There were hushed meetings behind closed doors, letters sent beyond the convent walls, and an air of unease that could not be concealed. I do not know if justice would ever come in the way I longed for, but knowing that silence no longer shielded him was its own small victory. Yet in the stillness of prayer, I faced my greatest struggle not with others, but within myself. My faith, once the bedrock of my existence, lay fractured. How could I reconcile a God of love with the suffering I had endured at the hands of his servant? How could I lift hymns of praise when my body carried scars left in the dark of night? For weeks, I went through the motions, my lips mouthing words that no longer stirred my soul. The chapel candles flickered, but they did not warm me. The scriptures were read, but the verses sounded hollow. It felt as if God himself had abandoned me, and I walked in shadows not only of memory but of belief. It was Sister Magdalene who noticed the dimming flame inside me. One evening, after Compline, she drew me aside. Her voice was gentle, yet steady. "Your faith is not gone," she said. "It has been wounded, just as you have. Healing faith takes time, just as healing the body does." She paused, then added, "But even shattered faith can be rebuilt, and sometimes what is rebuilt is stronger than what was first broken." Her words lodged deep within me. That night I knelt in my cell, not to pray in the old way, but to simply speak aloud the questions I had long buried. "Where were you, Lord? Why did you not stop it? Why must I carry these scars?" Tears soaked my hands as the questions spilled out, bitter and raw. For the first time, I did not try to silence them. I let them rise. And in the silence that followed, I felt something stir. Not an answer, not a sudden flood of peace, but the faintest whisper, "I was with you in the dark." It was not the thunder of certainty, but the flicker of presence. Enough to hold on to, enough to keep me from falling completely into despair. From that night, I began the slow work of rebuilding. I did not pretend the wounds were gone. I did not rush the process. Instead, I let myself be honest with God, angry, broken, questioning. I began to see that faith was not about never doubting, but about clinging to him even when the night was long. The other sisters, too, became part of my healing. Some who had once turned away began, slowly, to return. One left a small flower at my door. Another offered me extra bread at supper. Little gestures, but each one a thread of connection, weaving me back into the fabric of community. There were still those who avoided me, who could not face the scandal of truth, but I no longer measured my worth by their silence. My worth was not in their acceptance, nor in the judgment of men, but in the God who had kept me breathing through nights I thought would kill me. Rebuilding faith was not a straight path. Some days I rose with hope. Others, I collapsed under the weight of memory. But I learned that healing is not about perfection, it is about persistence. Each day, I chose to rise again, to keep living, to keep seeking light even when shadows lingered. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I felt life return to me. The hymns began to stir something once more. The candles glowed with warmth I could feel. My prayers, though still filled with questions, carried a sincerity that silence had once stolen. I was no longer the girl crushed by fear. I was a woman scarred, yes, but standing. I cannot say that my faith returned to what it once was. In truth, it never did. But it became something deeper, more weathered, more real. It was no longer the fragile faith of innocence, but the hard-earned faith of survival. And in that rebuilding, I found a new strength. A strength not only to endure, but to speak. To tell my story not as one crushed forever, but as one who had been broken and yet remained. This, I realized, was the beginning of a new chapter, not one of silence and shame, but one of truth and resilience. My shattered faith was slowly being pieced together, and though the cracks remained, they formed a pattern of grace. When I look back now, I sometimes marvel at the distance between the girl I once was and the woman I became. There are nights when the memories return, unbidden shadows pressing against my walls, voices I thought I had silenced forever. Yet those memories no longer define me. They are part of me, yes, etched into my skin and spirit like scars that will never fade. But scars, I have learned, are not only reminders of wounds, they are also proof of survival. I once believed that my story ended the moment I was broken, that the cruelty I endured had sealed my fate, but standing here, I see it differently. My story did not end in those dark nights. It began there. From pain came the possibility of change. From silence came the courage to speak. From betrayal came the seed of resilience that grew in places I thought were barren. In the years that followed, I carried both grief and strength in equal measure. There were days when I still felt unsteady, as though the ground beneath me might crumble. But there were also days when I discovered unexpected beauty. I began to notice how the sun lit the stained glass windows differently each morning, painting colors across the stone. I learned to listen for the laughter of younger sisters, a sound that reminded me that joy could live even among sorrow. And in quiet moments, I felt the faint but steady rhythm of my own heart, still beating, still choosing life. The church, in its way, moved slowly. Justice was not swift, nor was it complete. There were letters, inquiries, and decisions made far above my reach. I never saw the fullness of accountability I once prayed for. Yet even so, the silence was broken, and that mattered. He no longer walked the corridors with unchecked authority. His name, once spoken with reverence, became tinged with suspicion. And for me, that was enough to believe that truth, even delayed, could alter the course of things. But beyond justice, I had to face the deeper work. What legacy would I leave behind? Would I be remembered as a woman defined only by tragedy, or could I shape my life into something more? I chose the latter not because forgetting was possible, but because redemption was. Slowly, I began to mentor younger sisters, not with grand speeches, but with quiet presence. I would sit with them during their struggles, listen when they felt unseen, and remind them that even in silence, they were not alone. Some of them never knew the depth of what I had endured, but they felt my understanding, and that was enough. In serving them, I found a measure of healing for myself. There were times when my body still trembled, when fear would creep back in like a thief, but each time I chose not to hide. I would hold my rosary, breathe deeply, and remind myself, I am still here. And each time I repeated those words, they grew stronger, until they became less a plea and more a declaration. Faith, too, took on a new shape. It was no longer blind or untouched by pain. It was a faith forged in fire, tested in the crucible of suffering, and yet alive. I found comfort not in answers, but in presence, the quiet certainty that God had wept with me in the dark and stood with me in the light. This faith was imperfect, scarred like me, but real. And real faith, I discovered, was enough. The greatest gift of survival was not only freedom from fear, but the chance to tell my story, to speak aloud what had once been buried in silence. And in telling it, I carried not only my own truth, but also the truth of countless others whose voices had been silenced. Every time I spoke, I felt the weight of that shared burden and the hope that, in breaking silence, I was helping to set others free. I know now that healing is not a final destination but a lifelong journey. Some days the past still whispers, some nights the scars ache, but I do not despise them. They are the map of where I have been and the proof that I endured. They remind me not of weakness, but of resilience. If there is a legacy I leave behind, it is this: that even in the darkest of nights, hope can endure, that faith can be rebuilt, even when shattered, that a woman, once silenced, can rise again and speak her truth, and that scars, though permanent, can become symbols of strength rather than shame. To those who hear my story, I do not wish for pity. I wish for courage, the courage to speak, to believe in healing, to carry both sorrow and hope without letting one erase the other. My life has been marked by suffering, but it has also been marked by survival. And in survival, I found a kind of grace that no cruelty could destroy. As I walk through the chapel now, I pause at the altar where candles flicker against the stone. Their flames are small, fragile even, but together they create a glow that pushes back the shadows. I think of my own life in the same way, scarred, imperfect, but still shining. And so, with every breath I take, I carry the legacy of scars and hope. I am not the girl who was silenced. I am the woman who speaks. And though the road has been steep and marked with sorrow, I know this truth. Survival itself is a form of victory, and hope, once kindled, can never truly be extinguished.